Today we are talking about attachment theory. This is one of the most fascinating and maybe one of the most helpful theories within the psychology science. And it's super important to know because it tells us a lot about ourselves and a lot about how we interact with others. Attachment theory was developed by John Bowlby, and he essentially came to the conclusion that the way that we attach with our parents or caregivers when we're very, very young kind of sets the tone for how we go about life and how we work in our relationships there on out. There was originally 3 types of attachment, which were secure, avoidant, and anxious, and we are talking about anxious attachment in this video today. So if you think this might be you, stick around and hopefully you'll learn something from this, and I'm going to talk about how it might be impacting relationships in ways that you might not even have realized, and we'll talk about how to work with that. If you do come by this naturally, there is still definitely things that you can do to have a secure relationship even if you are a little bit more anxiously wired. So this experiment that John Bowlby did is one of the most fascinating experiments, I think, to me, and I won't go into all the detail about it. I'll put a link below if you want to read a little bit more about John Bowlby or attachment theory. But essentially he came to this conclusion by doing a very safe experiment with mothers and babies. And in the experiment, they had a mom drop off her baby in like a nursery type setting where there was other caregivers there to take care of the babies and play with them and that sort of thing. And then they would have mom leave, and mom was only out of that physical room for a few minutes, and they would just kind of observe the babies and see how babies reacted. And there's more to it than that, but that's the just brief version of how they started to chart behavior in babies and came up with these 3 different styles, like I said, of secure, avoidant, and anxious attachment. And so they noticed that in the anxious attachment baby, there is an overall sense of uncertainty. So, and this is something that, again, it starts when we're young, right? Very, very, very young. And it kind of sets the tone, and we carry that style with us. So even as the babies grow out of that stage, if they've developed this type of attachment style, then they kind of carry that with them. So the anxious attached baby was very unsettled, very very insecure, if I could put it that way, about mom leaving. Now, you need to read more about this so that you don't jump to conclusions here, because all babies go through phases where they love their mom or their parent, whichever parent it is, right, or caregiver, that they're just kind of extra attached to, and that's fine, and that's not what we're talking about. It was a longer observation and a longer study to really see that there was an overarching theme of uncertainty in these babies, that it wasn't just my mom's gone for a second and I'm not sure what's happening. It was an unsettling, I'm not okay type of thing. The other way that it is described is anxious ambivalent. Sometimes if you decide to look into this at all, you might see those 2 words used together or in place of each other. And the ambivalence is another way of describing discontent, really. So in observing these babies with anxious attachment, they just were very uncertain and discontent. So let's fast forward that into life in general. If you live life with a state of uncertainty or discontentment overall, right? We all have had those experiences at different times. I'm talking about you approach most situations or most relationships or most things with uncertainty or discontentment. If that is you, then maybe you do have anxious attachment style, but I want to dig into a little bit more. How does that impact your relationships? How is that impacting you and as an individual, and how is it maybe getting in the way of good, healthy, stable, secure relationships? So let's talk about that for a minute. Let's take out the therapy words for a second. Don't worry about anxious style or anxious attachment or ambivalence or those things. Let's just talk about it in the sense of uncertainty and discontentment. If those things are present in a marriage at all, or in a relationship that's a committed relationship, right? If those things are present, they really are not part of the recipe for a good, solid, secure relationship. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm talking in broad strokes here. I think most relationships have probably had at least a couple moments, if not a handful of moments, where there's been some discontentment or uncertainty, right? But I'm talking about an overall, very constant, common theme of discontentment and uncertainty. When that is present a vast majority of the time, it makes it very, very hard for that relationship to be secure and to feel secure, because uncertainty is quite the opposite of security, right? Or discontentment is quite opposite of security. So if there's a person, or maybe two people in a relationship even, that are coming at this partnership with uncertainty and discontentment about all sorts of things, it makes it really hard for that relationship to get some stable footing. So I want to see both sides for a minute here, okay? So if you're the person that maybe is a little bit more anxious, you come by that somewhat naturally, right? If we go back to what I said at the beginning, anxious attachment style, ambivalent attachment, that starts very young, and that is not on you, right? That's where we come from. That's what our nurturing and all of that was, and we don't have much control over that. However, I am a huge believer that we have more control over a lot of things in life than we think we do. I'm not saying we can control everything. I'm just saying there are things that we can do, or different choices that we can make, that sometimes can better our situation. And in this example, if you are an anxious, attached kind of person, or you're hearing some of these characteristics and you're like, yeah, that's me, I want to give you a sense of grace, right? Of, you came by that naturally. That's not on you. And maybe that's a whole nother thing for you to work through. But as it pertains to your relationship, I want you to know that you can still very much so develop healthy, secure relationships, even if you got robbed of some of that security growing up, right? So know that even if you come to that style naturally, it doesn't always have to be that way. And I want you to know there's some grace there. I also, this is the harder part to take in, is knowing that you come by that naturally, but it also might be something that is really, really impacting your relationship. And truthfully, it's something that could be robbing you and your partner of a happy, secure relationship, because you maybe tend to look through certain things through that lens of discontentment and uncertainty. So the other part of this that's really hard is, like I said, one, you come by it naturally. And the second part of that is the person who you're with is not the cause or the reason for this anxious attachment. However, they bear the burden in a sense. You bear your own burden of dealing with it, but they also bear the brunt of this anxious attachment style. They are in a place of feeling pressure and stress in the relationship for some of the discontentment and uncertainty, right? So I want you to hear me clearly. I'm not at all trying to put blame on an anxiously attached person or point fingers or anything like that. I'm simply just trying to open the door to what this can do to a relationship and how it can be so stressful. Obviously, we cannot undo our childhood attachment, and that's not what I'm saying. Again, there might be some personal work for you to do there if that is you, but more of what I want you to get from this video is that if that is you, and you notice that it might be impacting your relationship, you notice that it might be adding stress to you and your spouse or your partner, if you notice that it's causing a lot of struggle in your relationship, I want you to know that even if that is something that you come by naturally, your relationship can still absolutely be a securely attached relationship. We all have flaws, right? We're all very human. Our parents have flaws and are very human, and no matter where we come from, nobody comes from a perfect situation, right? Or a perfect attachment. You can have a secure attachment, but that doesn't mean that everything was rainbows and butterflies. So we all come from different things, and honestly, building a secure relationship together is a work all on its own, despite what each individual relationship, which each individual attachment style is. So if you don't get anything else from this, I want you to know, no matter what your individual attachment style is, your relationship can absolutely be secure. So that leads me to my last part of this, which is how. Okay, that sounds wonderful. Maybe I have anxious attachment or ambivalent. I'm discontent and uncertain about everything, and it's affecting my relationship. How do we fix that? How do we get to a place of having a secure relationship? So I'm going to answer that with 3 different approaches. The first is reread the message. If you have an anxious, ambivalent type attachment style, you're most likely reading it through the script of the what ifs and the fear and the uncertainty. Like I said, most things that come to you are going to be filtered through that what if question, that uncertain feeling. And this is the hardest work for anybody, but this is the most important work, is especially when it comes to your relationship, you have to retrain your brain, which is absolutely possible. You have to retrain your brain to reread the message and not let it go through that natural filter of the fears and the what if and the unknowns. You have to help yourself let it go through another filter. Give yourself another option. If you can immediately come up with 3 fear-filled scenarios about a situation, you can also come up with 3 positive ones, you know? I know it's hard to do. I absolutely know that. This is a random side note for you because I love to do that. But I will link this below. This has nothing to do with anxious attachment style, but it does, because there's this fascinating YouTube video, maybe a lot of you have even seen it. It's called The Backwards Bike, and this really awesome, smart, funny engineer guy decides that he's going to try, his friend makes a bike go the opposite of normal. So when you turn your handlebars this way, your bike normally goes that way, right? But they re-engineered it so that when you turn the handles to the right, the wheel actually goes to the left. So that is a trip for your brain. And he did this whole year-long, I think, experiment really on it, trying to retrain his brain to ride a bike, because we've all heard the example of it's just like riding a bike. You learn that as a kid, it's imprinted in your brain. It has a pathway, if you will, for how you do it. And it's something you really don't forget. You might feel awkward on it if you haven't been on a bike in 20 years, but you could most likely still ride that bike. So he was challenging that to say, well, can I redo this completely crossed, messed up bike? And he would go to places and tell people, if you can ride across the stage, I'll give you this $100 bill. And nobody could do it. And he got more and more fascinated about it, and meanwhile was practicing riding this backwards bike. And I'm gonna, spoiler alert, by the end of it, he teaches himself to ride this bike. And I'll let you watch it so you can see how long it took. But the point is that it is possible. I'm sharing that random story because that is proof that our brain is plastic, or elastic is another way they say it, meaning we can learn new things. We can change the way that we think about things, the way that we do things, including attachment styles. And I know some things run really deep, right? Some people have maybe some really deep trauma or some really deep struggle, and I'm not washing over that at all. That's why I said a couple times that if there's more there, maybe there's more to work through. But I still want to encourage that there is absolutely a possibility for change there. So back to my point with how does this relate to your relationship? Reread the message. You are ingrained, just like we're ingrained for that one direction of how to ride a bike, you're ingrained to read messages a certain way. So you have to train yourself to start reading them differently. You have to ask yourself the question, is this anxiety coming from something uncertain about my spouse or what they're doing? Or if I stop and think about this, is this really coming from me? Am I the one kind of producing this anxious feeling because of how I'm wired because of how I've approached things all along. You really need to make that differentiation. And sometimes maybe it is related to your spouse, and then that's a marriage issue that you guys work out, or a relationship issue. But a lot of times if you are in this attachment style, it might just be coming from you. And that's where you have to do the rewiring to say, okay, that's not right, or that's not fair to put that into our relationship. So I need to rewire and think about this differently so that it creates security in our relationship. The next point I would have is remind each other of certainty. And this is just really it's sort of like I'm thinking of an analogy on the fly, and what's coming to my mind is wood glue. So wood glue is like crazy strong. I don't know if you know this, but they have done little experiments or whatever, and for boards that are screwed together and boards that are glued together, the wood glue is actually way stronger and holds up better in tests and things like that. So wood glue is what's coming to my mind of how working on this, building certainty with each other, is putting your relationship together with something strong, as strong as wood glue, right? I hope this is making sense. But continuing to give each other certainty. So I want to be careful that this goes both ways. I'm thinking of a couple in particular that I've worked with where there was one person with extremely high anxiety, and the other person who almost was like, what's anxiety? They just did not experience life that way. So it was very stressful to them because they felt really kind of trapped, and their hands were tied with a lot of things in the relationship because the anxiety was driving so much of how they lived their life. And so I don't want it to sound like the person who's maybe less anxious constantly has to reassure the anxious person, right? There might be some of that, but I think what needs to happen to make it really successful is that both people can convey certainty to each other, right? There might be times where the less anxious one has to provide some of that, but that anxious person also needs to provide certainty as well, and maybe even verbally say, okay, yep, it's going to be okay. I trust that, whatever it is. That wood glue is really trust at the end of the day. And that's obviously a very important and big part of a relationship. My last tip for you is to be abundantly open and clear with each other. I've mentioned this in one of my other marriage videos, but it's just so underdone that I'm going to say it again. Be abundantly open and clear with each other, no matter which person you are. If you're the anxious person, be abundantly open and clear what it is for you to feel this anxiety. Even if your partner doesn't fully understand what it's like to be in your shoes, that's okay. They aren't going to be able to understand that, and that's okay. But be abundantly clear and open and honest about what that is like for you and how you are trying to work through that and trying to fix that, right? And if you're the other person who is less anxious, possibly, I want you to be abundantly clear and open about what it's like for you to be experiencing the waves of the anxiety in the relationship, because really it does affect both people quite a bit. So, and when I say abundantly clear and honest, I don't mean feisty and pointing fingers and pulling triggers. I just mean be really, really vulnerable. That's how you get to a secure relationship as well, is through being vulnerable. If you can't be vulnerable with each other and have it go well and have it be safe and things like that, then it's going to be super hard to get to that secure point, and you'll continue in this loop of the anxiety kind of running the show. So I hope this was helpful for you. If you have any thoughts, comments, questions, let me know. Hit all the buttons, and I will see you next time.